Hello all, Zysos here. So there was no stream on Thursday because I got a new computer and I hadn't got it set up for streaming yet. So uh, just let me know how this sounds because I don't know if I lost my sound settings, or at least my sound settings don't match the new hardware. So we'll see how they go. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about the cost of flipping to alter ego. Just as a broad term, because you probably realize that it is more dangerous to flip to alter ego. You're more likely to lose. Generally speeds up the game from the villain's standpoint. That's why you get strategies such as staying in hero mode all the time, and well, mainly staying in hero mode all the time, but also you start seeing some issues with characters that do need to flip every turn, or like She-Hulk, where they can be unable to flip and because of something going on, and then that slows down their game plan. So anyway, we're going to quickly go into this. Hopefully it won't take too long. We'll just quickly start with assumptions. So, card is a resource. I know in the last video we went over how card is not a resource, but it just makes the math so much easier. I don't think it'll actually come up this time because this is really reliant on villain values rather than the hero deck. So I don't think this assumption will impact us anyway, but it's still I'm still going to be using this going forward, so I put it here. It's just the numbers are too low to justify calculating it every single time when I can just use the one card, one resource equation. So the next one, 2 fort equals 3 damage equals 3 healing equals 2 resources. That's the conversion ratios that I've been using for the on-curve conversions, effectively, to determine where fort is equal to damage is equal to healing, etc. I'm pretty confident in these at these points. Anything I calculate with these values seems to work out relatively nicely. Like things that feel a little powerful end up being a little bit over this, and things that feel weak or things that feel weak typically are under this. So I'm pretty happy with these numbers just in general. I'm not considering boost effects, as I mentioned. This is they're highly reliant on villain scenarios. I'm not considering boost effects because boost effects are just they normally don't impact the actual damage of that attack or scheme. They normally either add on an additional effect or do something now, rather than impacting the threat or damage, and then they have to be mitigated different ways. For instance, if you get a minion, you need to mitigate it by somehow removing that minion rather than just reducing your damage by one more. You can't backflip from Green Goblin and not get a minion. I'm not considering encounter cards. It's too hard to look at in general. There's too much variation between scenarios, and you have to kind of work out the values for every single card in the set and the probability of drawing any particular card in the set. It's something you theoretically could do, but you would have to really know the encounter that you've set up. So the scenario cards, plus the modular set, plus the standard and expert cards, they all have to be considered, and it's just not something that we could do in general. You really need to do it for a particular setup. And I'm looking at expert mode with one copy of a single 2-pip obligation. This is what solo play for everyone that's not playing Hulk would be, like true solo play with everyone that's not playing Hulk on expert mode would be, and on heroic as well, actually. But it's just because there's going to be a lot. There's already a few tables in this, just because it's necessary to show the values that I'm talking about. So I needed to keep those tables to a reasonable amount. It's already going to be a lot of numbers. Not a lot of calculations this time though. Just a lot of numbers on the screen. Okay, before we get going, I didn't have enough space on some of these to write the name of each of the modular sets, so I just numbered them. This is the way I number them. It is release order. I think it's order and pack, and release order, then order in that pack. So bomb scares 1, master vehicles 2. If you open your core set, they will be in that order. And the Green Goblin scenario pack, it goes Green Goblin, Power Drain, Mess of Things, Running Interference. Pretty sure that's the order in that pack as well. I might be wrong about that. It might be a Mess of Things before Power Drain. And Cree Fanatic is obviously the most recent. I've also put some notes here. Bomb Scare is the closest to the average pips across all modular sets. If you actually work out how many pips are in modular sets and how many divided by how many cards there are, or average out the averages of each modular set, either of those two ways of trying to work out which is the closest to average number of pips in a modular set, Bomb Scare actually comes out closest. The second closest is actually Cree Fanatic. I know there's a big difference between their difficulty scales, but it also has the most boost effects, so because I'm not considering boost effects, it would be the most difference in actual difficulty versus what my calculations will actually show. So I didn't really want to use Cree Fanatic, even if it is I didn't really want to use it because it's the second most, but also because it has the most boost effects of any of these modular sets. Runner-up is Masters of Evil for boost effects, but Masters of Evil is also the lowest average pips, because almost all of them just have a boost effect, which makes it quite low. Legions and Doomsday both actually have the highest average. They have the highest average amount of pips. I think it's at 1.8 or something like that. And it's not really relevant for here, but they always end up with the highest values on attacks and schemes from villains. And Goblin Gimmicks is the only modular set to have a boost effect that can actually adjust the pips of a card of a attack or scheme. It's in Intimidation, I believe. It's got 1 pip on it and it draws a new card. So it's not really, I'm not gonna be considering that, but that is the one where the boost effects could actually be calculated into it, but it is quite difficult to calculate, and it's only 1 card. I didn't really need or want to go into that. So anyway, let's start with Rhino. These are the numbers that you would get based off the modular set. For attack or scheme, you'll notice that they're basically just the same number, but the differences are how much you add. Right, you add 3 to the attack in stage 2 and 4 in stage 3, and you always add 1 in the scheme. So these different modular sets, these have been rounded quite heavily. The numbers should be quite different, but they round to similar numbers when I'm only using 2 points. Didn't think it was that relevant to start showing 3 or 4 points for the points I'm making here. So the important things here, the scheme is always lower than the attack, but we would expect that. It's harder to remove threat than it is to heal damage, because recover stats are strictly higher than fraught stats, and frauding is kind of expensive. But these are obviously unadjusted. So what I've done is I've actually adjusted them with the ratios that we already have, the 3 to 2, 3 healing equals 2 fraught, So I just adjusted them and I bolded the ones that were higher. So in the case of Rhino, attack is always higher. He's always going to do more damage than he would have placed threat on the scheme. Meaning, in the case of Rhino, the argument could actually be made that it is better to flip into Alter Ego anytime you can, because you will actually, it's easier to he'll add less threat that you can remove for cheaper than the damage he would do that you would need to heal off later. Now, this can be a little dicey because but we'll get to that in a moment, in a minute. It's not going to be immediately following this. It's just because they're obviously his 7 on his main scheme. The 7 max threat is something you need to consider, but assuming that you had an infinite amount of threat, or not an infinite amount, but like some high amount of threat, and you just and some high amount of hit points. Somehow you've managed to multiply your HP and your scheme values by, say, 4 or 5, so that these numbers aren't going to hit the thresholds quite as easily. You would want to go to Alter Ego every turn, not Hero, which is weird because we often see discussion on staying in Hero form every game, although every turn. Although Rhino is the easiest scenario, so maybe it's part of that, but in turn, I decided to run the numbers using Bomb Scare. Because all these numbers are relatively consistent, I decided to use the average pip. The average pips across modulars, because most characters only get one modular set, so they're not actually being adjusted that much by the modular set. Seeing from these numbers here, they only go like, 0.1. There's like a 0.2 window between the lowest and highest. It's not a huge difference, which is because they're a small number relative to the number of scenario cards, and the variation between them is not actually that big. There's only like an average of 1 pip difference between the lowest, which is Masters of Evil, and the highest, the Legions and Doomsday Chair. So this kind of shows that the pips are relatively consistent across the modular sets we currently have. So I wanted to include it to show that, but I'm going to be using Bomb Scare because it's close to the averages we can get with a currently existing modular set. So using Bomb Scare and looking at some of the other villains, I've omitted Wrecking Crew entirely from this. Their mechanics with the side schemes just make it so that threat is a non-issue. You can let them scheme out. It normally takes them like 2, maybe 3 things to hit their breakpoint, and then they do tiny amounts of effect. Like Wrecker could be as low as 1.3 resources of damage of healing that you'll need to heal off. The Thunderball might cause you to lose up to 2 resources of damage in an attack. The Bulldozer does basically literally nothing, and Piledriver's the only one that's actually scary, because he may actually remove something that's actually valuable. But it's still going to take him like 2-3 schemes, so it's not worth running those numbers in Wrecking Crew. Just flip to Alter Ego any turn you can. It's probably worth it. Risky Business, I didn't put it in this top one because it has weird mechanics with the flipping, but it is down here because I can work out the numbers once I convert them. But it's dealing with damage it needs to deal with damage, healing, and attacking and frauding, so I didn't think it was justified to put it in this top table, because those numbers aren't real numbers for the most part. So anyway, once we convert the attacks and scheme values, divide the attacks by 1.5 to see what their actual resource values are. We find out Claw has a higher scheme. I put an asterisk next to Ultron here because this is only if you can deal with the drone before his attack finishes, which is possible with things like Hawkeye or if you're playing Black Widow. But it's would actually be 3.5, I believe. Yeah, 3.5 if the drone hits the table effectively, because the drone will hit you for 1 and he'll hit you for 1 more. So, and that adds up to the difference between his attack stat in stage 2 and stage 3. Which means he's actually, most of the time, 3.5 attack, resources of damage from the attack, and 3.2 resources on the scheme. Which means it's generally better to let him scheme again, much like Rhino. Mutagen, I have taken the liberty of assuming that you are preventing all the damage. If not, these numbers go from 2 and 2.7 to 3 and 4.7. He's not really easier on either side, though the minions put less damage out than they put out scheme value. So, and they often get put out from his boost effects. So that is a consideration there. And then Whiskey Business gets super weird because these first numbers are Norman Osborn, these second numbers are Green Goblin. So the reason I put in that he has a 2 scheme value on Green Goblin is that once he flips, he's effectively doing 4 resources of stuff. He's upped his own hit points by 2, so you now need to do 2 more damage. And he's effectively done 4 damage to you. He hasn't done it yet because but you're gonna have to flip him back at some point. So each of those tokens is worth about, each of his tokens on his state of mind is worth about 2. And that's the same is true for stage 3 as well. Except he now removes 2 when he schemes, so it's now worth 4 instead of 2. And on the flip side, when the attack from Norman Osborn is basically just damage, it's basically just healing, and he goes from 2 to 3, it's 1.3 is the 2 tokens added, so you got to do 2 more damage, 2 is 3 more damage. But relatively consistently the scheming is much worse, with the exception being when he is stage 2, when he is in stage 2 of in Green Goblin form, it is actually better to go into the alter ego and take the scheme by a little bit. So, I was expecting these numbers, especially these ones. I thought the Rhino ones would turn out like this. I was pretty sure the Rhino ones, the attack would come out ahead, but I was expecting these numbers to be more consistently towards the scheme side, just because I've played decks where you stay in hero form the whole game, and it feels a lot nicer. Whereas when we go to the next slide, the alter ego cost is actually somewhere between minus 1.5 and 1.3. You could be generating additional resources on top of the additional resources you generate from going into alter ego, the card and whatnot. But only really Claw is only really Claw is actually a downside to go into alter ego, which I thought was interesting. It doesn't really gel with my understanding of the game, so I was thinking about it further, and I came up with some like pros and cons that my analysis isn't really considering. So I've definitely heard this before, but there are a few ways to mitigate scheming. This is the one that I knew I was never really considering. I just didn't think these numbers would be quite so far out of whack with what I would normally consider without it. Um, so there are stun is more common than confuse. Defense exists both as a type of card that can be played as well as a stat on your character card, and both of those can be used um, to mitigate damage, but you can't use them to mitigate scheme. The only things that mitigate scheme are foiled and emergency. Um, and the last HP on an ally can be traded up, which is pretty important, because the good ally stat lines, the ones that have like 2 fort or 3 attack, they're only worth about 2 resources. So whenever they get to the point where they're going to die when they next use their stats, it's generally better to defend with them. We're all probably aware of this at the moment. It's not a lot of overkill going around, unless you're playing Creep Fanatic. Even then, there's only like 5 in the set. Um, the You can actually get some pretty big trade ups. So let's assume, if we're assuming that you're blocking with 2 value left on your ally, like this Rhino here, you could get 0.8 value just from blocking. You like actually gain 0.8 value from blocking, as opposed, and this one you could gain 1.5 instead of losing 2.2. So you kind of gain 3 value in stage 2 and 3.7 in stage 3, effectively. And yeah, the similar numbers could be used here. You're gaining this instead of losing this, and that's a big swing. Like, some of those are really big swings. This one here is one of the worst for scheme side. This puts you at like a 5, in the like 5 range, 5.1 range. This one here, 1.5, 4.7. Yeah, so this is why I believe the playstyle where you stay in hero form the whole time falls into place, because you can mitigate it easier. So once you start considering numbers like that, which yeah, so you get the 0.7 here instead of the 3 here, there's like a 4 cards, so you're looking somewhere between about 3 and 5 cards when you're considering mitigation. The fact that you can mitigate the attack but can't mitigate the scheme obviously depends on the character and the aspect. Like, concussive blow means you can actually mitigate the scheme, but justice actually can't as easily mitigate the attack. They have fewer allies and no stuns. So and certain characters, like in Captain Marvel's deck, there's the ally Spider Woman. She confuses. That's a confuse that you can use. And your defense stat is not great to start with, so you may actually be better to flip into Alter Ego in those cases. And as the game expands, as we get more options, presumably we're going to get more options for confusing and for mitigating threat placed. Like, we've already got since the game's release, we've already got foiled as an additional card for mitigating with the threat placed, and counterintelligence. Both of those mitigate threat placed, as opposed to the damage. And at some point you hit not really critical mass, but like a semi parity where you can choose to go one way or the other. And like, particular scenarios might actually favor one way or the other. Like, if you can mitigate threat placed by Rhino, then in his scheme, you may want to just stay in Alter Ego for the extra value. The other thing to consider is the lower thresholds. This was what I was talking about with the like 7 on the Rhino main scheme. Once you get closer to those thresholds, you're forced to take a worse option because you would lose if you took the better one, the typically better one. Similar things happen when you get low on hit points. This is what I feel. This is where I'm talking about it mainly from main scheme thresholds, but it's also why you would choose to flip to Alter Ego, even though it's kind of dicey, because you know you're going to die if you don't. Right? Better to have a chance of losing rather than a guaranteed loss. So that's the things that I think actually make Alter Ego cost. They're the things that mean that Alter Ego does actually have a cost, as opposed to most of these numbers work out such that the attack is more dangerous. But with these low thresholds and the mitigating of the scheme problem, you will you'll want to risk you'll want to take the attack instead of taking the scheme more often than not. And you can only get to like a 50-50 anyway, best case scenario most of the time. So anyway, next thing down. The next 3 things are how you can actually make up for the difference. So I said that there was like a 3 to 5 card cost if you're able to mitigate the attack, but not able to mitigate the scheme. So in that case, you've got to generate 3 to 5 cards. So you already know you're probably drawing 1 more card. Hand size increase, that's right at the bottom here. You might as well take the extra card when you can. It's helpful, but that we've still got to make 2 to 4 more cards by flipping into Alter Ego. So how do we do that? We look at the other things we can do. So we can gain access to Alter Ego abilities. That's pretty straightforward, honestly. You can generate a small amount of extra value with them. They're typically best used when you're going into Alter Ego, but you can get some of them. Some of them are good on both sides. Like for instance, Superhuman Law Division. Removing 2 threat is good. Like just holding onto 1 resource when you flip into Alter Ego is worth it, and then using another one when you get back the next turn is also worth it. But a lot of them like generate a card or a resource, and then you end up not being able to use that as efficiently that turn because you've just flipped into Alter Ego and can't get back into Hero to get a full use out of that ability. Or card. And so you got to consider whether that's getting you value both ways. This comes up a lot when you're talking about Miss Marvel. A lot of Miss Marvel decks, you'll end up with a discussion about what she can do on an Alter Ego turn. Like she generates a lot of resources when she flips into Alter Ego, but what can she do on that turn with all those resources? And you get things. That's why you start getting considerations like Lockjaw going into a Miss Marvel deck, so that if you happen to be able to get to full resources, but can't play anything because they're all hero actions, you can turn them into a Lockjaw to soak up that cost. And you can apply that logic to other things, but you're getting access to your Alter Ego abilities. You want to get the value out of those Alter Ego abilities, and if you can get about 3 cards of value out of those Alter Ego abilities, you're probably actually coming out ahead. She-Hulk's probably the best example of this. Her hand size difference is 2, so she's already getting 2 of the cards back. She generates 1 fraught effectively with the I Object ability. And she also effectively generates 2 attack, which is 1.3 damage, or 1.3 resources of damage. So you're getting like 4.3 resources, and that's without even considering things like Superhuman Law Division, that is an alter ego action that ends the ability to recover, which is one of her best stats. But so Superhuman Law Division, you pay 1 to get rid of 2, so you've effectively gained 1 every time you use it. That would put you up to like 5.3 resources worth of advantage from flipping to Alter Ego. That's without even recovering. You would want to be doing that like basically every turn because of the huge difference. Recovering, I already mentioned a bit in the lower threshold. Sometimes you have to flip to recover so that you can actually maintain your hero form. But there's no other really efficient healing. There's some that get close, particularly things like Med Team. Med Team is on curve, and Second Wind is just below curve. Obviously both protection cards, but you expect basic cards to be below curve because they're available to everyone. Otherwise, it would be hard to justify going into the protection where healing is plentiful in quotation marks. If all the basic options were really good as well. But recovery, it's just really good. Like, recovery is normally about 2 higher because it's in a 3 to 5 range currently, and attack is in a 1 to 3 range. So we're talking about like 1 point. It's like they basically just work out what the recovery stat would be as if it was a hero stat, as if it was like an attack or defense stat, and they just add 2 to it. So if your recover was supposed to be 1, you get 3 recover. And if your recover was supposed to be 3, you get 5. So just using recovery is normally generating an extra 1.3-ish versus your other stats. Depending on what it is, like if you've got 2s across the board and a 4, like Black Panther does, for recover, you're basically flipping to Alter Ego is generating you 2.6 resources versus you could have thwarted for 2, so you're gaining like a 0.6 from your recover. But it's obviously, it's a stat that you need versus a stat that you may not have needed. Like maybe you don't need a thwart this turn. So yeah, that's what I think you gain. You gain your you gain access to your recovery, your alter ego abilities, both on the card and on your both on your hero card and on your other cards in play, and the hand size increase, which is normally 1. And you are aiming to try and push that to the 3 to 5 range or more to justify going into alter ego, unless you can't mitigate the attack at all. If you can't mitigate the attack, I actually think it's better to stay in alter ego now, just because these numbers coincide with that, which I was not expecting that to be my conclusion at the end of this. I was expecting to come out of this thinking with numbers supporting hero form only being the best way to play, but this makes the went too far. This makes the choices a lot more interesting, and alter ego abilities more interesting in general. And the possibility of an overkill scenario could be quite difficult, because all of a sudden you actually have to play into these, and that's kind of like what would happen if you were to stay in alter ego all the time currently, where you can't mitigate it properly. And that just sounds weird. Um, we haven't got any spoiled pure overkill scenarios though, so um, it may never happen. They might just throw it in as surprise, like Pre-Fanatic does. But I would expect to see it at some point on at least one scenario, I guess. When that point is, we'll see. It could legitimately be a couple of weeks from now. Rise of Red Skull's only 2 weeks out, which is why you're not seeing any red. If you're watching this from the future, that's why you're not seeing anything from Red Skull box in the analysis here. I've actually tried to consider every single scenario that we currently have, and yeah, but not picking and choosing like I normally do with heroes. Anyway, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. Once again, my takeaways were just that the staying in hero form is not as cheap as I initially thought. It's only cheap if you can mitigate the attack, but there are more options to mitigate the attack, specifically allies and stun being more common, and the defense abilities and stats, which there's no equivalent for thwarting. So if, for almost all characters, the exception being Claw, for almost all scenarios, exception being Claw, you're probably better off flipping to alter ego if you can't mitigate the damage from the attack, which seems counterintuitive to me from what I've experienced in game, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that I may need to adjust my thinking going forward, which I will be attempting to do. I'll have to consider this a bit more closely when I'm actually playing games. But if you are able to mitigate it, you need, if you have the option to mitigate it, you need to generate a lot of value. Somewhere between 3 and 5 cards in order to justify flipping to alter ego, which some characters can do, some characters can't. Characters that can't probably want to play and go into a game plan that stays in hero form the whole game. Okay, so, yep, final conclusions are done. I pretty much just repeated myself from the last minute, sorry about that. And this is just the credits for the slide pack that I'm using. It's quite, I quite like it, but that is that. Okay, I shall see you next time.